And we are back live with another Between the Pages book chat. And today our guest is fantasy author Sean Valiente. Hope I got that right.
Perfect.
And he's here to talk about his book, The Lightning Knight, which is book one of the Knights of Nine. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him introduce himself. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So again, I'm Sean Valiente. This is my debut novel. It's a epic fantasy series, kind of straddling that line between young adult, new adult, and epic. The book itself is almost 500 pages long, so it's a tome, if you will, but it's a page turner. It's very much molded in that classic fantasy type. You have heroes, you have villains, you have magic, uh, elves, dragons, swords, sorcery, the whole nine yards. So really harkening back to those classical fantasy stories. But what I've done is I've taken a lot of those tropes, particularly around the chosen one and the hero's journey, and I've really kind of twisted and turned them upside down. So hopefully there's enough surprises and twists and turns to not make it seem like the same old, same old. But at the same time, it's kind of like reading and hanging out with your best friend. That's kind of the theme of that book. It follows our protagonist, Oliver Quartermaine. He is sort of a mentor to a chosen one named Poe, and and Oliver's meant to find and save magic. And the fun thing is he doesn't know anything about magic, and he's not quite sure if he even believes in it. But along the way, throughout the book, he's going to be given a lot of different quests, some of them made up himself, kind of in a sort of 16, 17-year-old dumb boy notion of like, oh, I'm going to make a quest to try and date this one girl, and those kind of fun things. So he's going to be learning a lot about how the world is, how much it's different than what he thought, and a lot of the themes of identity and friendship and teamwork and race and understanding sort of who you are and what you want to do in the world are going to pop up. So it's a really fun book. It's the first book in a planned series. Unsure how many books it's going to be at the current moment, but it's going to be quite a few. And it's a really fun book with a lot of action for people who love a good classic fantasy story.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the main characters. What are they like? Their personalities, their little quirks.
Yeah, so the first main character is Oliver Quartermaine. Again, he's a 16, 17-year-old kid. He's kind of like a Tony Stark-esque character. He comes from a wealthy family. He's very smart. He has like an eidetic memory. His family made their fortune throughout the years smithing, so they essentially invent and build a lot of the world's weapons and contraptions and armors and things like that. And so he's come to a point where he doesn't really know what he wants to do. He's 16. He could go into the family business. He could do a myriad of other things, and he really doesn't know what he wants to focus on. He is going to be quested with finding and saving magic again. And so beyond that, he really starts to kind of mature and develop throughout the book, along with his two best friends, Rock and Yokel. And you start to see the three of them really come into their own as characters. They kind of start off as a little merry band of like three kind of teenage boys who act similarly from hanging out all the time, and then they start to take divergent paths away from each other, which is really interesting. And also, those three meet two other characters. They're called Night Angels. They're named after elven folk heroes Windrunner and Pathfinder. And these are two female characters who one of them Oliver becomes smitten with. At the same time, he has his heart being pulled towards a girl he likes at school. And then beyond that, he gets a crush on a different girl he meets later on in the book as well. So a lot of teenage romance and a lot of teenage angst pop up throughout the book as well. And that's really the core of Oliver, right? He has all these tools and he has all of these abilities and opportunities. He just doesn't know what he wants to do with it all. And the quirk with him is that he craves engagement and he craves being with people, and especially his friends. But at the same time, whenever things get tough, or whenever he comes to a hard part in his life, he tends to withdraw and run away, which only exacerbates the problem for him internally, but also exacerbates the problems he's dealing with externally as well. So he's a very complex character. He's got a lot of emotions going on, kind of like any other teenager would feel. And then so he's our main character. Throughout the first part of the book, you're really inside of his head, and then the second part of the book really pushes the plot forward with his quests and what he's trying to do.
Well, it sounds like an interesting character, and you got a good handle on the teenage mentality. So
yeah, you'll notice that throughout the book, Oliver is a very prototypical quote unquote dumb boy, right? Like things are very obvious right in front of him, and he doesn't even notice. He has a one-track mind, and he kind of sees everybody through the lens of how he sees them. And not maybe necessarily the depth that they have. So in particular, with his two best friends, Rock and Yokel, he kind of sees them one-dimensionally. He sees Rock as kind of a jock who comes from a poorer part of town, and he sees Yokel as a socially inept, very smart kid who comes from a wealthy part of town like him. And he doesn't really see the depths that they have because he kind of just sees them how he reflects upon them or projects upon them. So it's fun to, as a reader, you can kind of understand, hey, there's these other characters and they're really cool and interesting, but Oliver only sees them one way, and which is kind of like how it is to be a teenager, right? You see things in your own kind of tunnel, and you don't really notice like, oh, other people have lives, other people have depths, other people have ideas and multitudes to them. You're just kind of seeing, oh, this is my friend who plays a sport. Well, they probably do other things as well. So Oliver is definitely your teenage boy, and when you're reading it, you'll probably cringe a little bit, harkening back to your own teenage years and being like, oh man, I definitely remember feeling just like that.
Yeah, it gives the character a nice place to grow too. So
yeah, definitely. It's fun because the series is gonna follow Oliver along with other characters along the way. But the series is probably gonna span in book time maybe like 7 to 10 years. So you're really going to see Oliver grow from that, 16, 17-year-old boy until he's like 25, 26 years old. And really that maturity, right, of from becoming a young adult to a new adult to a mid 20 something year old, and how they mature and how they harken back to, oh man, I used to do that when I was younger, or I used to think that way. And then learning that maturity and still having issues, the same issues they had when they were teenagers to, later on in life. It's kind of very reflective of how life is.
okay, so what were your reasons or inspirations for writing the series?
Yeah, so I had this idea for a scene in 8th grade writing class. And it was this scene where these two characters were just in a jail cell and talking with each other back and forth. And then something happens to the jail cell and they end up escaping, right? And that scene always kind of stuck in my head as like, this is a really cool jumping off point of how two characters can meet. And then in high school, I was an avid fantasy reader. My first love is the Godfather himself, Tolkien. And I fell in love with how fantasy could be used as allegory or a metaphor for, how real life acts in just a completely different setting. So in high school, I ended up reading by Christopher Paolini, Aragon, and he was 16 when he wrote it. And I fell in love with that book, and I was like, wow, this is so cool. If he's 16, he can write it. I bet I might have a story in my head as well. So I started to come up with this idea for a character who would eventually evolve into Oliver. And I started taking notes, and I joined a creative writing club after school, and I started writing out scenes, and it always stuck in my head like this one character, who do I want them to be? And so I kept taking notes for the next decade throughout high school, throughout college, and this character started to evolve into somebody who was really interested in identity and having the availability to do things, but not knowing or having the direction to do them. And then I started having these other characters pop up as foils, as mirrors, and as, just separate entities beyond the main character. And that's kind of how it all sort of started. I started to think about the characters first and who they were. And then I started writing the story and seeing where they ended up taking me. And for me, it's my writing style is a little bit one part pantser, part plotter, where I know point A and point B, where I want the characters to start and where I want them to end, but everything in the middle, I have no idea what's going to happen. So I start at the starting point and I transcribe what's happening, kind of like watching a TV series. And so everything that's happening is new and exciting to me. So it's really fun, that part of the process, to say, oh, I wonder what's going to happen next. Let's find out. And starting to write those characters, and they'll just take you on different paths. And that's kind of how Oliver and this story developed, right? It was, I knew I wanted to get from point A to point B, and then they just kind of became their own beings.
Okay, so what's your world like? Is it medieval, based modern day?
Yeah, it is. I'd probably say 75% medieval and 25%, steampunk or 1600s, 1500s type world building. So what's interesting about the world itself is that it's very much your classical fantasy medieval type, but there's these odd and kind of out of place things, such as, like, there's a steam engine in the world, and there's these other little things that don't seem like they should be there, and that's actually part of the plot and part of the world building itself, is that while they live in this sort of medieval time, there's these things that seem out of place, and you're like, well, I don't know why that's there, but sooner or later throughout the books, you're going to find out exactly why, and that'll be a really interesting device and plot point.
Ooh, little teaser there. So, what was the hardest scene or type of scene for you to write in the book?
Well, I think I have two different answers, right? So the hardest scene to write for the book was definitely a couple of kind of the heart-wrencher scenes where we lose some characters, whether we don't see them anymore or whether they die. I found those scenes to be a little particularly hard, mostly because finding a pace and finding the words to convey the emotions of the scene without, really inundating it with, too much descriptive or imagery, or really slowing down the pace of the scene, right? So sometimes you have to say goodbye to a character, whether they're leaving or whether they're dying. And there's a fine balance you have to do with how much you want to, extend that, how much emotion you want to convey, and how much you want to leave up to the reader to have their own emotion pour into the book as well. So that was really the hardest scenes to write. The more difficult scenes for me to write were probably the more romantic scenes, mostly because my mom is a very nice Christian lady, and I was writing those scenes to make sure that she would be able to read them and not be like, oh, Sean, how could you write this? This is so awkward. So, a lot of them were starting to kiss and then, blowing out the candle and then end of the chapter. And I didn't get too much more erotic than that, mostly because I knew my mom would be reading these one day.
Yeah, romantic scenes are always difficult to write. I mean, I avoid them whenever possible myself.
Yeah, it's also like, you really have to just put yourself out there if you're going to go all in on a romantic scene, right? Because your friends are going to be reading them, and then they're going to say, oh, this is a reflection of how you think about romantic scenes. And it just, sometimes you're just like, no, this is the characters. It's not me. I promise.
Yeah, I'm in all respect to romance writers, because they make it look easy. They do it.
Oh my God, they are some of the best writers out there. Not only from the quantity they pump out of quality stuff, but like the ability to write these kind of emotional scenes and scenes in general, and not really like, I'm assuming they just like don't even think twice about it. They're just like go all in and have no filter, and it's just they always come out amazing. Romance writers are some of the best writers out there.
I agree. So, what was your favorite scene or type of scene to write in the book?
Well, me being a boy myself, and also my family sport growing up was karate. So a lot of the action scenes were definitely my favorite, mostly because I was able to infuse a lot of kind of karate and that thinking and that mindset into it. Not just from like a martial point of view, but from some of the more theological and philosophical point of views of karate and self-defense, and taking it that way, and some of the more mechanics of it as well. Throughout my book, you'll see there's references to elven fighting forms, and it's very, stringent on, there's 24 different forms. There's some offensive, some defensive. There's different types used for different scenarios and for different weapons. And those scenes tended to really get my juices flowing when I knew there was going to be a big, action scene or a battle or something like that. And I was like, okay, I can really, get into this. And while it was fun, it was definitely probably the one I had to self edit the most during the writing process, mostly because you tend to write those scenes like you would stage, choreograph on a TV series, right? Like, and his left foot planted like this, and his right arm came up like this, and then he swung forward. And really, the best action scenes don't go too much into the description of what they're doing. They do this really nice line of, here's what's happening so you can follow along in your head. But at the same time, here's what they're feeling, and here's what's happening around them, and here's what the stakes are, right? It's not just like, I thrust my sword, he parried, I blocked, and then I rolled to my right, right? Like that's action, but it's not an action scene. It's really about, I thrust my sword forward, and I knew, what might happen, and what would happen if I missed, and what the consequences are of that. And I'm listening about this person I'm protecting behind me, and all this stuff that's going around. And then in particular, a lot of my characters like to take an approach from Spider-Man and Deadpool, where while they're fighting, they like to talk a lot, which isn't something that happens in real life. Like in real life, when people are, fighting, whether it's, on the battlefield or in a tournament, there's not a lot of talking going on. So it's a lot of, action, reaction, things like that. But in a book, you get to kind of expand that out a little bit and see what they're really thinking, see how they're feeling, and have a little bit of jibber jabber back and forth. So those are always really, really fun for me.
Okay, so are any of your secondary characters a little quirky or like to steal scenes from the main characters?
Yes. So I have 5, 6 different side characters that are really kind of integral to the story, right? So we have Rock and Yokel, who are Oliver's best friends. And Rock is going through all of these kind of different emotions, from kind of a death of a family member to where he is status-wise in society and things like that. So he really starts to, at the beginning, he's kind of this dumb jock sort of persona, but he starts to really steal scenes of emotion later on in the series, and really captivates you by what his kind of inner turmoil is. With Yokel, he's got a stuttering problem, which is an interesting quirk in that it really only comes out when he's flustered, but when he starts to have more self-confidence, it doesn't shine through. So he is just super smart and really awkward, and Oliver and Rock make fun of him all the time, but he's just kind of takes it and along in stride and goes with it. Beyond that, the Pathfinder and Windrunner, the two Night Angels, they're very sassy and very fierce and powerful women who take no crap from anyone, especially from the boys. And they take over scenes, and you fall in love with them, and you're like, wow, I would love to follow a whole book of these two women instead of Oliver, which is definitely the feeling I want, right? Like, I want you to not only be invested in Oliver as a character, but be invested in, like, oh, sometimes he annoys me like a teenager would. I'd rather follow these two awesome ladies. And then lastly, it's Poe, who is bright-eyed and innocent and just wants to change the world. He's like 12, 13 years old. He's kind of the quote-unquote chosen one. And whenever he's in a scene, it's earnest and it's sincere, and your heart just like melts for him. You're just like, oh, Poe, you're such a good kid.
Okay, so obviously you write in the fantasy genre, but are there any other genres you'd like to try or have tried?
Well, this is my first book, so I haven't tried writing in too many other series or genres in and of itself. I really like the idea of sci-fi. I know that kind of melds really easily with fantasy, but there are some nice differences in sci-fi that you can explore beyond what you can in fantasy. And then I think beyond that, I'm not too interested in other genres. If I were, it might be something along the lines of, a mystery or a thriller of some type, something that's a little bit more modern day setting, or even, historical fiction. I'm really a big fan of history, so I think taking a historical event and fictionalizing it into making it a little bit cooler would be really fun.
I'm a big fan of history myself, and I'm currently writing a historical fantasy novel. So,
oh, nice.
Yeah, yeah, that one still got to work on that though. I got like 4 books going on right now. So yeah. Anyway, so I think we'll wrap it up here for today, and I'll let you tell everybody where they can find you and your books.
Awesome. Yeah. So again, I'm Sean Valiente, author of The Lightning Knight, the first book in the series of the Knights of Nine. You can find me on Facebook, or you can find my books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore. You just have to tell them to look it up and order it for you online.
Yeah, and definitely go have a look at it because it has an absolutely gorgeous cover.
That cover was designed by my sister-in-law. So if anybody needs a cover design, let me know.
Oh yeah, she's got talent. Very
She does.
Stunning cover. And I also linked your book down in the description if anyone wants to go check it out. So, and
awesome.
I'd like to thank you for being here today. It's lovely chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And we'll be back next weekend with 2 more authors. So join us then. Bye for now.